Just in case you're a little fuzzy about the basic concepts of grammar, let's have a quick review.
Grammar is how the parts of the language, basically the words and punctuation, fit together to make sentences. We use grammar to communicate effectively with our friends, coworkers, and teachers. The grammar we most often use in formal written communication is SEAE, Standard Edited American English.
We place words into different groups called the parts of speech. The different parts of speech are nouns, pronouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and interjections.
From there, we put these parts of speech into action by constructing sentences. Knowing how to construct these sentences correctly will improve your writing immensely.
But remember, writing is a process, so don't make yourself crazy fretting about grammar when you're first writing your ideas down. Deal with it when you're editing your work.
Okay, now that we've talked about the parts of speech and the roles that each of them play, it's time to put the pieces together and see what we get.
Part 5. Sentences.
Section A, simple sentences.
Remember, we define grammar as how the parts of our language fit together to make sentences. Now, the grammar of the sentence is called syntax. There are 3 basic types of sentences, each with their own basic rules of syntax.
The most basic type of sentence you will encounter is called a simple sentence. Simple because all of the elements within the sentence are either part of the subject or the predicate.
The subject of a sentence is the part that performs the action of the main verb. The simple subject is the specific noun that is performing this action. Everything together is called the complete subject. For example, in a sentence, the happy little child kicked the gnome over the fence. Child is the noun that is performing the action of the verb kicked. That makes child the simple subject. Since the, happy, and little modify or relate to our simple subject child, they are also included in the complete subject, the happy little child.
The predicate of a sentence consists of the main verb, which is called the simple predicate, and everything that goes with it. This makes the predicate pretty much everything that's not part of the subject. This whole part is called the complete predicate.
In our sentence, the happy little child kicked the gnome over the fence, we can identify kicked as the verb, so it's our simple predicate. Because the gnome and over the fence refer to exactly what was kicked and where it was kicked, we include those as part of our complete predicate.
So, in the sentence, the happy little child kicked the gnome over the fence, we can say that the happy little child is the complete subject, while kicked the gnome over the fence is the complete predicate. Child is the simple subject, and kicked is the simple predicate.
So far, so good, right? Actually, there's one more thing we need to say about simple sentences. Occasionally, a simple sentence can get by without a subject or predicate.
Well, suppose we take our sentence and we change it into a command. A command is a sentence that is directed to the second person, that is you. That's right, I mean you. So, a command is directed at you, but get this, the you is taken out of the sentence. It's only implied. Now, let's change our sentence, the happy child kicked the gnome over the fence, into a command.
Kick that gnome over the fence is a command because we're telling someone, you, to do something. We know that the verb kick heads off our predicate, and that gnome and over the fence relate to kick, which leaves for our subject, well, nothing.
If I say to you, kick that gnome over the fence, who would actually be doing the kicking? That's right, you. So what we are really saying is, hey you, kick that gnome over the fence. Here we would say that the subject, you, is implied. Voila, a sentence we could write without a subject.
Well, that's all well and good, but how, you may ask, could you possibly leave out the verb? Earlier we got away without using a subject because we inherently knew who the subject was. Well, we can do the same thing with verbs. Consider this.
Who kicked the gnome over the fence? Cindy. In this example, the second sentence, Cindy, is just one word. It can be called a complete sentence because the predicate is obviously implied in the preceding sentence. In other words, what the second sentence is really saying is Cindy kicked the gnome over the fence.
Section B, phrases and objects.
So there we have it, the simple sentence. And although we think simple sentences are great, you have to admit that our writing would be pretty boring without some variety in sentence structure. But before we go on, we have to stop and learn a couple new terms, phrases and objects.
A phrase is a group of words that is not a sentence and that may contain either a subject or a predicate, but not both. They're somewhere in between words and sentences.
Suppose we say, Boppo, that crazy monkey, will not stop jumping on my bed. This sentence has many of those phrase thingies. Let's take a look. First, we can isolate that crazy monkey as a group of closely related words within the sentence. This one is called an appositive phrase. Now, this is not a positive phrase like way to go. This is an appositive phrase, which is different.
An appositive phrase is a descriptive phrase that either restates a noun or pronoun in a sentence or adds new information about it. In our sentence, Boppo, that crazy monkey, will not stop jumping on my bed, the appositive phrase, that crazy monkey, is just another way of saying Boppo, the simple subject of our sentence. Appositives are a great way to elaborate on a vague subject like we do here, because if we didn't use the appositive phrase, that crazy monkey, we might think Boppo was a cat, or a German shepherd, or a tax lawyer.
We can also treat the predicate itself as a phrase, which we would call a verb phrase. As you've probably already guessed in Boppo, that crazy monkey will not stop jumping on my bed, our verb phrase will be, will not stop jumping on my bed.
Sometimes we will even find phrases within other phrases. In the verb phrase, will not stop jumping on my bed, we can identify the smaller phrase, on my bed. Since this phrase is centered around the word on, which is a preposition, we call this a prepositional phrase. That makes sense.
So a phrase is really just a group of closely related words in a sentence that can have a subject or a predicate, but not both. There are lots of different kinds of phrases. The ones we've discussed are positive phrases, verb phrases, and prepositional phrases.
The second term we need to nail down before delving into compound and complex sentences is objects. An object is a noun that is not the simple subject itself, but is instead a part of the predicate or part of the subject phrase. There are a couple of exceptions, but we'll get to those after we discuss some of the different kinds of objects. Let's see what kinds of objects we can identify in this sentence.
Carmen is giving the filthy llama a bath in her backyard. The nouns in this sentence are Carmen, llama, bath, and backyard.
We know that Carmen is the simple subject of the sentence because she's the one doing the action, in this case giving a bath. That makes the rest of our non-subject nouns, llama, bath, and backyard, objects.
Back to our sentence. Carmen is giving the filthy llama a bath in her backyard. First, let's look at bath. In this sentence, bath is what is known as a direct object, or the noun that receives the action of the verb. The direct object of a sentence answers the question who or what. In this case, what is Carmen giving? The answer is a bath.
So, a noun that receives the action of the verb is called the direct object. Another kind of object we see in this sentence is an indirect object. While the direct object answers the question who or what, the indirect object answers the question to or for whom or to or for what. In our sentence, when we ask, to what is Carmen giving a bath? The answer is, the filthy llama. So, llama is the indirect object of our sentence. Llama.
Let's recap. The direct object of a sentence will answer the question who or what receives the action of the verb, while an indirect object answers the question to or for whom or to or for what.
Let's look at our sentence again. Carmen is giving the filthy llama a bath in her backyard. We know that Carmen is the subject, and we've just learned that bath is the direct object and llama is the indirect object. The last noun on our list is backyard. Remember when we were talking about phrases and we discovered that a preposition can have its own phrase. When we look back at our sentence, we see that backyard is part of the prepositional phrase in her backyard. Backyard is a noun, but since it doesn't perform any action, it's an object. It comes after the preposition in, so we'll call it the object of the preposition.
There are other kinds of objects, but direct and indirect objects and objects of the preposition are the ones you'll encounter the most when reading and writing.
So we now know that an object is any noun in a sentence that is not the simple subject. Remember we said there are a couple of exceptions? Here they are: predicate nominatives, nouns of direct address, and appositives. We'll take them one at a time.
Check out this sentence. George is a giraffe. Let's identify the simple subject first. That's fairly easy. George. Now it seems like giraffe might be an object. In fact, we may be inclined to call it the direct object because it answers the question, what is George?
Well, not so fast. We need to look at our verb. George is a giraffe is our sentence, so the verb is. As we remember, is a form of the verb to be.
Now, here's the important part. When the verb is what we call a linking verb, we call non-subject nouns or pronouns the predicate nominative.
Hey, settle. We'll take each term one at a time.
Linking verb. This is a verb that just sort of is. It links a subject to something else in the sentence. Common linking verbs are to be, to become, and to remain.
Non-subject noun. This is a noun in the sentence that doesn't perform any action. That means it's not the subject, so it's the non-subject noun.
A predicate nominative is a noun or pronoun that follows a linking verb and renames or identifies the subject of the sentence.
Let's see how all this fits in with our sentence. George is a giraffe.
George is our subject. We've established that. Next, is. Okay, this is our linking verb. What does it link? It links our subject, George, with the other noun, giraffe. Giraffe renames what George is. This makes giraffe the infamous predicate nominative.
Easy peasy, kick you in the kneesy. Let's try another sentence.
Reginald, your club sandwich is getting cold. At first, we may want to say Reginald is the simple subject, but that's not true since he is not the one getting cold. The sandwich is. Well then, what exactly is Reginald, you may ask? We call this a noun of direct address since he is the one we're talking to. We're addressing Reginald. Quite a mouthful.
The last exception we're going to talk about is called an appositive. We mentioned appositives earlier in the section on phrases. An appositive is a noun that restates the subject of the sentence. Look at this sentence.
Olivia, my favorite houseplant, grew 1/18 of an inch today. At first, this sentence seems to have two simple subjects, Olivia and houseplant, but that's not really how it works. Olivia is our simple subject because, well, it comes first, leaving houseplant as our appositive since it's just restating the noun, Olivia.
Let's review a bit. Simple sentences. All the elements of simple sentences are either part of the subject or part of the predicate.
A phrase is a group of words that contains either a subject or a predicate, but not both. A phrase is not a sentence, no matter how hard it tries to be.
An appositive phrase restates the simple subject of a sentence or adds new information to it.
An object is a noun that is not the simple subject of a sentence itself, but is either part of the predicate or the subject phrase. There are two types of objects, direct objects and indirect objects. A direct object receives the action of the sentence and often answers the question, who or what. An indirect object explains who or what the action of the sentence was done for. Thus, it answers the questions, to or for whom, or to or for what.
Now we're ready to look at how we can use these to build bigger, brighter, shinier sentences, the compound and the complex. Don't let the names scare you. Let's try compound sentences first.
Section C, compound and complex sentences.
Compound sentences are merely two or more simple sentences stitched together by a conjunction or a mark of punctuation, like a colon, semicolon, or a dash.
Remember, a conjunction is simply a word that links together parts of a sentence.
For more information on how to use these extra nifty punctuation marks, be sure to check out The Untamed World of Punctuation. Growl.
Let's look at the following sentence. It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine.
This sentence is really just two smaller sentences hooked together by a conjunction, in this case, and. When a sentence is used as a component in another, bigger, fancier sentence, we call it a clause.
When we look at the sentence, it's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine, we see that it consists of two clauses, each of which can stand as its own sentence.
Sentence 1. It's the end of the world as we know it. Sentence 2. I feel fine.
When a clause can stand as a sentence on its own like these two, we call it an independent clause.
Now, say you've got two perfectly good independent clauses and you want to stick them together to create a compound sentence. Well, don't feel like you have to use a conjunction. Try one of three handy little punctuation marks, either the colon, semicolon, or the dash.
If you do decide to use one of these punctuation marks, it's important that you use the appropriate one for your sentence construction needs.
The colon is used when the second independent clause helps explain the first one. Suppose we want to connect these two sentences. I love my two sisters. They bake me pie.
Although this is correct, we have an opportunity to combine these two simple sentences to form a compound sentence. Since the second sentence elaborates and helps explain the first, we can use a colon.
A colon is a punctuation mark we use very specifically. The colon tells us that whatever follows the colon helps to explain what came before the colon.
The second sentence, they bake me pie, explains why I love my two sisters. So we can write, I love my two sisters, colon, they bake me pie.
Our next punctuation mark, the semicolon, means roughly end.
If we go back to the compound sentence we looked at earlier, it's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine, we can instead write, it's the end of the world as we know it, semicolon, I feel fine. See how the semicolon basically just means and?
Finally, a dash is used when the second clause is a sort of reversal of the first clause or contains some surprising element. Look at this sentence.
There are many options for someone interested in purchasing a quality comb. I usually find wonderful combs in the dumpster.
Again, here we combine two independent clauses to create one compound sentence. There are many options for someone interested in purchasing a quality comb, dash. I usually find wonderful combs in the dumpster. We choose to use a dash because the second clause carried a twist on the first one.
So, we can combine simple sentences to create compound sentences one of four ways. We can use a conjunction, a colon, a semicolon, or a dash.
Now we know exactly how to create a compound sentence, and we know several ways to do it. But before we go on to talk about complex sentences, we must bring up a common pitfall that can nail us when we're dealing with these sentences.
A frequent error in SEAE is to break two clauses into two sentences, but to keep the conjunction. Teachers and bosses will have their red ink pens poised and ready to nail you for this one.
This mistake is called a sentence fragment. It's what you get when you try to pass off a portion of a sentence that cannot stand on its own as a complete sentence.
Suppose we want to separate this compound sentence into two simple sentences. My pet Komodo dragon is as gentle as a lamb because he has no teeth. When we separate these two clauses, we must remove the word because, or we will get one complete sentence and one sentence fragment. My pet Komodo dragon is as gentle as a lamb is the complete sentence. Because he has no teeth is the sentence fragment. So, we need to make the last sentence just, he has no teeth.
We've talked about simple sentences, and we've tackled the compound sentence with its notorious fragment trap. Now it's time for the complex sentence.
Up to this point, we've been dealing with independent clauses, or complete sentences that can stand alone. A dependent clause, however, is a clause that cannot stand on its own and is dependent on the sturdier independent clause. In fact, if you try to pass a dependent clause off as a complete sentence, you'll end up in that same old fragment trap we talked about earlier.
A complex sentence can be created by combining a dependent clause with an independent clause. Here's a complex sentence. See if you can identify both the dependent and independent clause.
Although Tom sleeps regularly, he is constantly tired. First, we must break down the sentence into its two clauses. In this case, although Tom sleeps regularly, and he is constantly tired. The second clause can stand on its own, but the first one can't. If we just say, although Tom sleeps regularly, we're really left hanging, waiting for the continuation of the thought. So this is a dependent clause.
A compound sentence is a sentence that consists of two or more simple sentences. These simple sentences are joined by either a conjunction or a punctuation mark, like a colon, semicolon, or a dash.
Complex sentences can contain an independent clause and a dependent clause. An independent clause is a clause that can stand by itself as a sentence. A dependent clause cannot stand by itself as a separate sentence.
Now that you're up to speed, let's learn a little bit more about that versatile language we speak, English.
Part 1. Stretching exercises. The flexibility of the English language.
Section A. Things change.
The English language is a living, breathing organism, and like any living thing, to survive, it must adapt to its environment.
So to stay alive and vibrant in everyday usage, the language must change. And change in language means change in grammar.
And this means that some things that were once strict grammar rules are now just, well, shall we say, grammar suggestions. What was unacceptable yesterday may be fairly kosher today.
So rules like the use of contractions, split infinitives, and the ending of sentences with prepositions are not as forbidden as they once were.
The same premise holds true for the future. What we call errors today may become perfectly acceptable usage in the generations to come.
But we do need to know what's acceptable these days and what's not. That's where syntax comes in.
Syntax is basically the grammar of sentences. So when we write sentences, we make sure we follow the rules that say how they should be written.
When we do, then we're using proper syntax. If your writing is full of improper syntax, then you could run into trouble in class, on your papers, or at your job, or on your resume.
So you can be creative when speaking and writing, but if you go too far and totally snap the rules of grammar in two, nobody will understand you.
Patch our trainly, he all along plopped, green, green, groovy.
So, to communicate properly, remember that even as our language changes and grows, proper syntax is mucho important.
The English language is constantly changing, growing, and evolving. To communicate effectively, be sure to use proper syntax, which is the grammar of sentences.
Grammar is how the parts of the language, basically the words and punctuation, fit together to make sentences.
We place words into different groups called the parts of speech. The different parts of speech are nouns, pronouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and interjections.
From there, we put these parts of speech into action by constructing sentences.